Welcome to Horror Hours, where fear tucks you in and the dark keeps you company. Tonight, you'll hear terrifying tales whispered into the dark, stories that slip into your dreams and stay there. So tuck in tight, dim the lights, and let these stories come to light. If you enjoy tonight's content, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it's greatly appreciated.
Belmist Hollow was the sort of place people drove around, not through. Tucked between unmarked roads and forgotten forest land, in the northern countryside, it had once been a prosperous mining village, but time had closed its fist around Belmist, leaving only scattered descendants and memories too heavy to speak aloud. Even maps had stopped marking its boundaries. The trees had grown thicker, taller. What roads once carved through the woods were now tangled in roots and moss, like nature was trying to erase the mistake of man's interference. Eli Hames had never heard of Belmist before he got lost. His car, a boxy green wagon with a humming radiator and an old soul, had sputtered to a steaming halt just after sunset. His GPS showed a grey block of no signal. He was somewhere between where he'd been and where he meant to go, and the road beneath his tyres had become little more than a gravel-broken whisper of a trail. It didn't help that Hollis, his smoky grey cat and most consistent companion, had leapt from the back seat and perched on the dashboard, staring into the woods as if something called her. "Don't start, Hollis," Eli muttered, opening his door. The air outside was strangely warm for autumn, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sweet, honeysuckle maybe, or wildflowers. The woods loomed like watching things, quiet and too still. He had been travelling for 6 days between towns, looking for a forgotten copy of The Unwritten Atlas, a book that may or may not exist. It was what he did: follow rumours of strange books, collect them and lend them out through the wandering library, a system few knew about and fewer truly believed in. He had slept in barns and empty bell towers, but something about these woods gave him pause. Then he saw it, a narrow footpath leading away from the overgrown ditch. It curved behind a curtain of low-hanging willow branches, too deliberate to be made by deer or time. He glanced at Hollis, who blinked once. "Well," he sighed, "not like we're going anywhere else." With only a flashlight and his satchel of books, Eli stepped off the road and into the whisper of Belmist Hollow.
The path curved gently downhill, weaving through thick trunks and patches of fog that slivered along the forest floor like slow-moving ghosts. Trees leaned overhead like gossiping old women, their leaves trembling despite the lack of wind. Every few steps, Eli's boot would sink just slightly into the moss-covered earth. A bird chirped once, then stopped abruptly. Hollis padded ahead without hesitation, tail high, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure Eli hadn't gotten lost behind her. He kept the flashlight aimed at the ground, catching glimpses of toadstools, forgotten stones, and something that looked like an old tin toy buried in mud. It was odd. This path didn't feel abandoned. It felt preserved, like it was waiting
After about 15 minutes, the trees parted. There, nestled in a hollow beneath a low ridge, stood a house. It was 2 stories tall, narrow and steep-roofed, its pale wooden siding faded to a greyish white. Ivy climbed every corner, thick and blooming despite the season. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle, wrapped in a railing of wrought iron twisted like vines. A lantern hung from a chain above the door, swaying even though the air was still. But it was the windows that struck Eli first. Every single one, 12 in total, was closed tightly and covered with gauzy curtains from the inside. They looked almost like eyes, watching him silently. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing. "Not what I expected," he murmured. Hollis gave a short meow and trotted toward the porch, her paws silent against the leaf-carpeted ground. The steps didn't creak under her weight, but when Eli followed, they groaned beneath his boots like something waking up. The front door had no knob, only a bronze ring set into the wood. He knocked twice. Nothing. Then, slowly, the door swung open on silent hinges. Inside was dim light, warmth, and the faint scent of lilacs and old paper. Eli stepped inside.
The door eased shut behind him without a push. Eli paused, letting his eyes adjust to the interior light. It wasn't electric, no buzzing overhead, no wall switches, just a warm, steady glow that seemed to emanate from several lanterns mounted along the walls. Their flames flickered behind glass panes painted with faint floral patterns, casting dappled reflections that danced like spirits on the wallpaper. The entryway opened into a long parlour lined with old portraits in gilded frames. Dust clung to the floorboards, but nowhere else. The air smelled aged but clean, like a room sealed tightly for decades and only recently reopened. There was no furniture in this first room save for a coat rack with 2 pegs, one empty and one holding a child's faded red cloak. Eli ran his hand across the wallpaper. It was embossed with vines and faded roses. "Somebody's been taking care of this place," he murmured. Hollis sniffed around the baseboards, her tail twitching with interest. She made a low chirping sound and padded deeper into the house. To the left was a sitting room, complete with a velvet chaise, lace-covered side tables, and a massive bookshelf that stretched to the ceiling. Books, dozens of them, sat arranged in perfect condition, their spines gleaming despite the obvious age. A fire crackled in the hearth, and above the mantel hung a single photograph. Eli stepped closer. The photo was old, perhaps late 1800s, and slightly blurred from age. It showed a man, a woman, and a young girl with pale eyes and a serious expression. The girl held a doll that seemed to wear the same red cloak as the one on the coat rack. Beneath the photo, engraved in brass, "The Hales, 1894. The warmth from the hearth was real, not imagined, and Eli found himself sinking into the nearest armchair, a dusty but comfortable seat upholstered in wine-coloured brocade. Hollis hopped up onto the armrest and curled into a neat loaf, her eyes watching the flames dance. The longer they sat, the more the house seemed to breathe around them. Subtle creaks, a faint ticking from somewhere deeper inside, and the soft, rhythmic groan of timbers settling. He pulled out a notebook from his satchel and began to jot down what he'd seen so far. Unmarked path, unmapped house, lanterns, gas, oil, unclear, photo dated 1894, occupants, Hale family. He was mid-sentence when he heard it, a whisper, soft, barely audible, like someone exhaling words from behind a closed door. Eli froze, pen hovering over the page.
He looked toward the hallway past the sitting room where the sound had come from. Hollis lifted her head and let out a low meow, her ears tilted toward the sound. He rose and followed it. The hallway was lined with wallpaper even older than the parlors, patterned in deep green and gold. Framed sketches hung crookedly, scenes of trees, streams, and what looked like the house itself, always with a figure at the window, too small to make out. The whispering stopped as he approached the last door on the left. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with one finger. Inside was a study smaller than he expected. A writing desk sat against the wall, cluttered with yellowed papers, and an inkwell long dried. A lamp with a green glass shade glowed softly in the corner. The room smelled of cedar, ink, and something faintly floral. On the desk was a letter addressed to no one in particular. The handwriting was neat but urgent. "If you find this place, you are the first in many years. This house remembers. My daughter's voice is caught in the walls. I built it so she wouldn't be lost." Eli read the note twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into his notebook. He wasn't alone here, not entirely, and something, or someone, had been waiting for him to listen. Eli didn't leave the study right away. He stood in the warm glow of the green lamp, listening not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something attuned to silence. There were no more whispers, but he could sense the house holding its breath. Hollis trotted into the study, leapt onto the desk, and nudged a corner of the papers with her paw. Something shifted, another note hidden beneath the others. Eli gently pulled it free. It was shorter than the first, the ink shaky and darker. "She is in the walls. She sings when it rains." He reread the lines slowly, then folded it into his coat pocket. "I guess I'm staying," he said aloud. The house offered no objection. He returned to the sitting room and explored more thoroughly. There was a door tucked behind a velvet curtain, leading to a modest kitchen. The counters were made of butcher block, and a deep stone sink sat below a narrow window that overlooked the back garden. Wild now, but once well kept. A cold tea kettle rested on the stovetop, and a jar of dried lavender sat open on a shelf. A wooden staircase wound up beside the kitchen, narrow and uncarpeted. Eli considered it. It felt too soon, too intimate to climb it. He turned back to the parlor. A low hum stopped him. It was faint, melodic, a lullaby. He turned toward the fireplace. The flames had dimmed slightly. Above them, the photo of the Hale family seemed subtly altered. The little girl's eyes had shifted. They now looked directly at him. Eli's breath caught. He stepped closer, searching the image. Was it his imagination? No. The expression had softened, almost curious. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. He turned quickly. Nothing. Just the hallway. But Hollis was staring at something invisible, ears flattened. Something was moving upstairs. Eli moved slowly, each step calculated, listening for the creaks above. The sound hadn't repeated, but it lingered like a scent in the air, something unmistakably real, yet unwilling to show itself. "Hollis," he whispered. She didn't move from the rug in front of the fire, but her gaze remained locked on the dark stairwell. Her tail lashed once. The lullaby had faded, replaced now by a heavier silence. It pressed on Eli's ears, like the moment before thunder. He adjusted his satchel and walked toward the staircase, footsteps echoing slightly in the hush. The first stair groaned and the house seemed to react. Subtle tension coiled in its beams, but nothing stopped him. No cold gust, no shadow rushing past, just his breath and the sound of Hollis's claws ticking faintly behind him as she decided, reluctantly, to follow. The second floor landing was narrower than expected. Low ceilings, flowered wallpaper peeling at the edges and doors. 4 of them, all closed, all unmarked. But it wasn't the doors that drew Eli's attention. It was the wall at the end of the hall. It was covered in photographs, old ones, sepia-toned, curling with age, dozens, maybe hundreds, arranged in perfect lines. Each showed a child. Some smiling, others not. Different time periods, different clothing, different places. But all of them were alone, and every Every one of them wore a red item: hat, ribbon, cloak. Eli's heart beat faster. One photo in the top center was larger than the rest. It showed the same little girl from the mantle photo. This time, she stood in a field of white flowers, expression unreadable. The sky behind her was clouded, and faintly, almost invisibly, there was a figure in the tree line, watching. Beneath it, handwritten in shaky ink: Lenora Hale, born 1885. Never found. Eli stood before the wall of photographs longer than he meant to. His eyes kept drifting across the children's faces, and with each pass he began to notice subtle changes: a tilt of the head, a glint in the eye, a mouth that might have been smiling a moment ago, no longer. He took a step back. Hollis let out a sharp hiss. She stood with her back arched, tail puffed, facing the door second from the left. A single groan echoed from behind it, low as if a weight shifted just on the other side. Eli approached slowly, the floor cold through the soles of his boots. The door was plain pine with a porcelain knob, worn smooth from time. He reached for it, locked. He rattled it once, twice, firm but not forceful. The knob refused to turn. From the other side came a quiet thump, not aggressive, more like a knock, a response. He leaned in, placing his ear against the wood. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, "Help me!" The voice was high, distant, a child's voice. "Lenora," Eli whispered. Silence. He stepped back. "What happened to you?" Still nothing. He turned to Hollis, but the cat was no longer angry. She had relaxed, sitting with her head cocked to one side, ears flicking, like she heard something too faint for human ears. Downstairs, the grandfather clock began to chime.
1, 2, 3.
But Eli had counted 7 strikes before it stopped. When he looked back at the wall of photographs, Lenora's picture was gone. Eli's breath caught. The empty space where Lenora's photo had hung felt like a wound in the room itself. He scanned the surrounding pictures, half expecting to see it reappear. But the wall was just a patch of bare, peeling wallpaper now. "Hollis," he said softly. The cat blinked up at him, her fur still slightly puffed from earlier tension, but her gaze calm and steady. He turned back toward the locked door. The whispered plea, "Help me," echoed faintly in his mind. Something about it felt different now, less a cry of fear, more a longing for release. Eli ran his fingers along the doorframe, then stepped back. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Suddenly, a cold draft curled around his ankles. The warmth from downstairs was gone. He shivered, the hairs on his neck standing on end. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady but low. No reply. Only the faint rustling of the wallpaper, as if the house itself was breathing. Slowly, he reached into his satchel and pulled out the small journal he'd found earlier, the one with the letter from Edwin Hale. Flipping through its blank pages, he found a pencil tucked inside and began to write. "I am here. I hear you." He set the book down on the floor by the door and waited. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The house creaked, whispered, and sighed. The faintest sound of a lullaby drifted down the hallway, the same tune he'd heard earlier. Then, softly, a faint tapping began on the other side of the door. Slow, patient. Eli knelt, pressed his ear to the wood, and whispered back, "I'm coming." Eli took a deep breath and crouched, searching along the base of the doorframe. His fingers traced the edges, feeling for anything unusual. At the bottom corner, where the wallpaper peeled most, his fingertips brushed against a small, almost invisible latch. Heart pounding, He flicked it upwards. The door's lock clicked softly. With trembling hands, Eli turned the porcelain knob and eased the door open. Beyond was a narrow, dimly lit room, no taller than a closet, with stone walls damp to the touch. The air smelled of earth and something faintly sweet, like old perfume. In the center lay a small cot, covered with a moth-eaten blanket. A wooden chest rested beside it, its surface carved with delicate patterns of vines and flowers. On the wall opposite the door hung a faded tapestry, its image hard to make out, but Eli could just make the outline of a young girl with wide eyes and flowing hair. He stepped inside, the floor cold beneath his boots. Hollis slipped in behind him, ears twitching nervously. Eli reached for the chest and lifted its lid. Inside were a handful of items: a cracked porcelain doll, its face chipped but still hauntingly beautiful, a worn leather-bound book with no title, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. He picked up the letters, loosening the ribbon. The top letter was dated 1895 and addressed to "My dearest Lenora." His eyes scanned the opening lines. "If you are reading this, my sweet child, then you are not lost. We will find you, wherever you are trapped. Hold on to hope." The house groaned softly, as if agreeing. Eli looked down at the doll, feeling a chill.
Somehow this room held a piece of Lenora, and a secret waiting to be uncovered. Eli carefully opened the worn leather-bound book he'd found in the chest. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with delicate, slanting handwriting. As he read, the diary began to tell the story of Lenora Hale, a curious and bright child whose laughter once filled the halls of the house. But the entries darkened quickly. There were mentions of shadows at the windows, strange voices at night, and the house itself seeming to shift and breathe. One entry stood out. "Father says the house will protect me if I stay quiet, but I hear her singing through the walls. The nights are long, and I am so very lonely." Eli's fingers trembled. The singing, the lullaby, was more than a memory. It was a presence. Hollis meowed softly, brushing against his leg. A sudden knock echoed behind him. The study door he had left open was now closed. Eli glanced toward it, unease prickling his skin. "Who's there?" he called. No answer, just the sound of the wind outside, or perhaps something else. The house whispered again, a voice just beyond hearing. Eli knew this was no ordinary place, and Lenora's story was far from over. That wraps up the first story. Spooky, wasn't it? If you liked it, consider subscribing to the channel, as it's greatly appreciated. The next story we have coming up is titled The Whispering Light. Rowan's car cut through the thick fog like a ghost, headlights barely piercing the clammy grey that clung to the coastal cliffs. The letter had been cryptic, a heavy, cream-coloured envelope sealed with black wax stamped with a strange emblem, resembling a twisting wave, encircling a single, flickering flame. It bore no return address, only an invitation to the seeker of forgotten truths. Come to Greyhaven. The lighthouse waits, and so does the light's keeper. Curiosity had always pulled Rowan toward the uncanny, the places where reality thinned and secrets whispered on the wind. Greyhaven was the kind of town that seemed carved from the edge of the world, where the sea battered rocky shores with relentless fury, and the sky often wept mist that chilled the bones. Arriving just as the sun bled its last light across the horizon, Rowan found himself swallowed by a landscape both beautiful and unnerving. Narrow cobblestone streets twisted unpredictably, flanked by houses with chipped white paint and sagging porches. Windows stared blankly, some cracked like fractured eyes, reflecting little of the dusk's dying glow.
The air was thick with salt, but also something faintly metallic, like iron rusting long beneath the waves. The town's few residents were shadows themselves, moving hurriedly, faces turned away or eyes darting nervously. At the inn, Rowan was met by Marla, the innkeeper. She was a woman weathered beyond her years, with deep lines etched by worry and eyes sharp as sea glass. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're not from here," she said, studying him as if weighing whether he was danger or salvation. "Few come willingly. Fewer stay when the night falls." Rowan met her gaze evenly. "I am here about the lighthouse keeper. I understand he disappeared." Marla's lips pressed tight. "Aye, but some things best left alone. The light doesn't just guide ships anymore. It watches, and it waits." That night, as Rowan lay in his small room, the wind whipped through cracks in the window frame, carrying the steady mechanical pulse of the lighthouse beacon far off on the cliffs. Beneath that rhythm, faint voices drifted, soft, almost mournful, like a song half remembered. The whispers tangled with the sea's roar and the creak of old timber, pulling him toward an unsettling truth that would soon consume everything. The path leading from the town to the lighthouse was narrow and treacherous, winding through gnarled pines and jagged rocks, slick with moss and salt spray. Each step Rowan took was muffled by layers of fallen needles and brambles, the scent of damp earth heavy in the air. The sky above was a bruised canvas of slate-grey clouds, blotting out the stars as a thick fog began to rise from the sea, creeping slowly inland like a living thing. At the base of the towering lighthouse stood the keeper's cottage, an ancient, weather-beaten shack clinging to the cliff's edge like a barnacle. Its faded white paint was cracked and peeling, and thick ivy strangled the timbers, curling over the roof in tangled coils. Windows were shuttered, but one sagging door hung cracked open, creaking softly with the sigh of the ocean wind. Rowan hesitated on the threshold, the air around him suddenly colder, the salt tang mixed with a faint metallic scent that made his stomach churn. Inside, the cottage was a capsule of another time. Dust motes hung suspended in the weak light, filtering through grimy panes, settling on a clutter of overturned furniture, maps brittle with age, and scattered logs burning low in a rusted stove. On a rickety wooden chair lay a weathered, leather-bound diary. Rowan's fingers trembled as he opened it, the brittle pages whispering secrets. The entries were frantic and unsteady, scribbled warnings about strange lights beneath the waves, creeping mists that swallowed sound, and an overwhelming loneliness that gnawed at the keeper's mind. One passage chilled Rowan's blood. They come with the tide, their eyes glowing beneath the dark water. The light calls to them, draws them close like moths to flame. I must stay inside. I must not answer. A sudden knock echoed against the weathered doorframe, slow, deliberate. Rowan spun around, heart pounding, but the empty room held only shadows and the sound of waves crashing far below. Outside, the fog thickened, swirling like restless spirits. Something unseen watched from the darkness, waiting. The knocking at the door faded into silence, replaced by the relentless roar of the ocean smashing against the jagged cliffs below. Rowan stepped outside the cottage, the fog curling around his ankles like cold fingers. The air was dense and salty, heavy enough to taste,
and the world had shrunk to a muted grey haze that swallowed the horizon. Ahead, the sea stretched, vast and unknowable, its surface broken by flickering pale lights bobbing like ghostly lanterns just beyond the breakers. They pulsed softly, drifting with the tide, as if guided by some unseen hand. A voice drifted on the wind, soft, lilting, and impossibly distant. It was a song, haunting and sweet, carried on the crashing waves like a siren's call. Rowan's skin prickled. "Hello?" His voice was swallowed instantly by the fog, the words swallowed by the sea's endless murmurs. His gaze followed a trail of footprints in the sand, but they were strange footprints, small and uneven, like those of a child, leading to the edge of the water where they vanished into the surf. As Rowan turned back toward the lighthouse, the great beam swung abruptly in his direction, its bright white light piercing the fog like a blade. The air turned icy cold, and the whispers began again. Fractured words he couldn't quite grasp, circling him in a dizzying dance. Beside him, Hollis, the stray cat who had trailed him from town, hissed low, her fur bristling as she stared into the mist with wide, unblinking eyes. "We're not alone," Rowan murmured, his breath catching in the chill air. Something moved beneath the waves, something ancient watching, and the light was beckoning. Rowan's boots echoed hollowly on the spiral iron staircase as he ascended inside the lighthouse. The sound swallowed almost immediately by the thick stone walls. Each step was slick with sea moisture, and the sharp tang of salt hung in the air like a warning. The narrow stairwell twisted upward, tightening as it climbed toward the lantern room, the walls seeming to close in around him like the ribs of some great beast. A low, unplaceable hum thrummed through the metal railing beneath his fingers, vibrating faintly with a pulse that matched the sweeping beacon above. When Rowan finally emerged into the lantern room, the view stole his breath. The great Fresnel lens towered before him, an enormous, shimmering crystal apparatus, its facets catching the pale glow of oil lamps arranged around the room. The light it cast fractured the gloom into shards of fractured rainbows that danced on the curved walls. It felt alive, almost sentient, as if the whole chamber were breathing. Rowan's eyes caught something tucked behind a loose brick near the base of the lens. A tattered leather journal, bound by salt-stained twine. Opening it carefully, he read the faded, cramped handwriting of Jonathan Hale, a keeper long lost to time. The lighthouse does not merely warn ships from rocky shoals. It is a beacon for something older, something beneath the waves. The whisperers, spirits trapped between sea and shore, drawn inexorably to the light as moths to a flame. Should the light falter, they rise, and all who linger near the shore are lost. A cold draught swept through the lantern room, and Rowan shivered as he glanced out the misted windows. Beneath the surface of the roiling sea, he saw them, shadowy shapes shifting in the dark water, eyes glowing faintly like dying embers, watching him with ancient hunger. The beam swung slowly toward him, bathing his face in its cold, pale glow. The evening air hung thick and heavy as Rowan made his way back down the rocky path toward Greyhaven. The lighthouse's steady beam carved a pale arc through the creeping fog, its light washing over the cliffs in eerie, rhythmic pulses. At the foot of the path, Marla waited, her face ashen and drawn tight with worry. Her hands clutched a lantern, its flickering flame casting long shadows across the damp cobblestones. "They say the tide takes people," she whispered, voice trembling like the sea breeze. "Every few years, someone vanishes near the cliffs. They say the light, it calls to them. The whisperers want more." "Calls to them? What do you mean?" "At night, if you listen closely, you can hear the song. It's beautiful, but deadly. Those who follow it are lost forever, swallowed by the sea or dragged into the fog. No one ever returns." A cold shudder traced Rowan's spine. The weight of her words settled like a stone in his chest. That night, Rowan sat on the porch of the inn, the leather-bound diary resting heavily in his lap. Darkness swallowed the town, and only the lighthouse's beam cut through the night like a blade of spectral light. From somewhere far off, the whispers returned, soft voices weaving together in a haunting melody, rising and falling like waves. His eyes locked on the distant shore where a pale figure appeared at the water's edge. She was translucent, shimmering faintly like moonlight on the ocean. Her eyes, hollow yet brimming with sorrow, met Rowan's. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving nothing but a chilling silence and the steady beat of the lighthouse's warning light. The next morning, Rowan awoke to a sky bruised with heavy clouds, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The town was quieter than before, as if the very stones held their breath. Marla's warning echoed in his mind as he set out toward the cliffs again, determined to uncover the secrets she guarded so closely. "There's a path," she had said in a hushed voice, "a narrow trail few dare take. It winds down past the cliffs to the caves, the place where the whisperers gather when the tide is high. No one who ventures there comes back the same, if they come back at all." Rowan found the trail concealed beneath gnarled roots and thorny brambles, barely visible in the dim morning light. The scent of salt and decay was stronger here, and the wind carried whispers tangled with the distant crash of waves. Each step down the treacherous path was a battle against loose stones and biting cold. The cliffs loomed overhead, jagged teeth against the grey sky, while beneath the sea churned with restless hunger. At the trail's end, Rowan reached the cave entrance, a yawning maw of darkness, curling into the rock, veins of dampness running down its walls. Bioluminescent algae cast an eerie green glow on the slick stone, creating dancing shadows that seemed alive. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, heavy with salt, and something fouler, an ancient scent of things long buried. The walls echoed with faint, indistinct whispers, voices rising and falling in a maddening, wordless chant. Suddenly, from the shadows stepped a man soaked through with sea spray, wild-eyed and trembling. "They come with the tide," he rasped, voice cracking. "The light isn't protection, it's a beacon, a summons. They want the living to join them, to cross over." Before Rowan could respond, the man vanished into the swirling mist, swallowed by the darkness like a broken echo. The whispering grew louder, surrounding Rowan, pressing in with cold fingers of dread. He realized then that the boundary between land and sea, between the living and the lost, was thinner here. Dangerously thin. Back in the dim warmth of the inn, Rowan's hands trembled as he pried loose a floorboard Marla had hesitated to mention. Beneath the creaking boards lay a hidden cache, a dusty wooden box filled with fragile journals and faded letters, yellowed with age and stained by salt and time. Each journal belonged to a previous lighthouse keeper, their spidery handwriting chronicling a long history of dread. Every keeper warned of the same relentless terror, the whisperers bound to the sea, forever drawn to the light. One letter, written in desperate, nearly illegible script, was stained with tears and salt. If you find this, heed my warning. Do not extinguish the light. It binds them, holds them at bay, but beware. The light can never shine alone. It demands a price. The keeper must remain, watching, or the shadows will drown the shore. Rowan's breath caught in his throat as the inn's lantern flickered suddenly and died, plunging the room into suffocating darkness. In the black silence, the whispering began again. Soft at first, but growing, an endless chant curling through the shadows like smoke, voices urging, pleading, haunting. Rowan fumbled for a match, his fingers shaking as the shadows seemed to press closer, the cold seeping deep into his bones. The light must never go out. The weight of those words settled over him like a curse. Midnight settled over Greyhaven like a shroud, the fog thickening into a suffocating blanket that swallowed the town whole. The lighthouse beams sliced through the mist, a solitary eye scanning the dark coastline with relentless precision. Drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist, Rowan made his way back to the cliffs. The path was slick and treacherous, shadows twisting into sinister shapes among the rocks and thorny bushes. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness, a hollow sound swallowed by the crashing waves below. As he reached the edge of the cliffs, Rowan's breath hitched. Figures had gathered on the shore, ghostly silhouettes shifting in and out of the swirling fog. Their forms were translucent, shimmering with an otherworldly glow, eyes vacant yet burning with a desperate longing. They did not speak, but their silence was louder than any scream. They watched the lighthouse beam like moths drawn to a flame, their gaze filled with sorrow and hunger. Suddenly, one figure stepped forward, a woman draped in seaweed, hair tangled with salt and debris. Her eyes were deep wells of empty sorrow, and yet there was a haunting plea in her gaze. She began to sing. Her voice was a mournful melody that seemed to seep from the sea itself, ancient and beautiful, but laced with unimaginable grief. The haunting song wrapped around Rowan's senses, pulling him toward the edge, toward the dark water. He realized with a chill that the light was their tether, the fragile link binding these restless spirits to the world of the living, and keeping something darker locked beneath the waves. The first pale fingers of dawn bled through the heavy clouds, casting the cliffs in cold, grey light. Rowan stood alone at the lighthouse's lantern room, the air thick with salt and silence, broken only by the distant roar of the restless sea. Around him the fog swirled, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Below on the shore, the whisperers had gathered again, silent, spectral figures whose glowing eyes burned with a desperate hunger. They reached toward the light, their mournful wails rising like a chorus of lost souls. Rowan's heart pounded as he faced the terrible truth laid bare before him. The lighthouse's beam was not merely a beacon of safety, it was a cage, a prison keeping these tormented spirits tethered to the sea. To extinguish the light would be to unleash them, and with them an ancient darkness that could consume everything. But to keep the light burning came with a terrible cost. He stared at the switch, cold metal gleaming beneath his shaking fingers. The air seemed to hum with expectation, charged with the weight of centuries of keepers who had faced this same choice and failed. "Do I let them go?" Rowan whispered, voice cracking. "Or do I stay and watch?" The walls of the lantern room seemed to close in, shadows twisting and lengthening. The wind howled through cracks in the stone, carrying voices, whispers of past keepers, warnings, pleas. With a deep, shuddering breath, Rowan reached out. Rowan's fingers trembled as he flipped the switch. The beam faltered, sputtering like a dying star before steadying once more, piercing the fog with its cold, relentless glow. A terrible, wailing sound rose from the shore, a chorus of anguish and rage as the whisperers recoiled, their ghostly forms dissolving into the crashing waves, dragged back beneath the sea's endless depths. But the relief was short-lived. A crushing weight settled on Rowan's chest, a cold hand gripping his heart. The air thickened, the room darkened, and he realized the true cost of the light's power. He was no longer just a visitor or an intruder. He was the lighthouse's keeper now, bound to the endless vigil. The voices of past keepers whispered in his mind, haunting and insistent. "Watch the light, never let it fade. The sea waits, and so do they." As dawn broke, Rowan looked out over Greyhaven, silent, shrouded in mist, but safe for now. The lighthouse stood tall against the sky, its beam cutting a path through the dawn, and Rowan understood the light would never go out. He would never leave. He was the keeper, the watcher, the tether between the living and the lost, and the whispering lights would never rest. Still listening along? Get ready for this next story, as it's bound to leave you watching over your shoulder. The shadows of Blackwood Manor.
The old town of Blackwood sat swallowed in an eternal dusk, wrapped in dense woods that breathed mist and secrets.
Rowan's car rattled along the cracked cobblestone road leading to Blackwood Manor, its grand silhouette looming like a dark monument against the slate-grey sky. He had come with only a letter that had arrived 6 days earlier, typed on brittle paper with no signature, only the words, "Your inheritance awaits. Blackwood Manor holds the answers. Come before the fog claims it forever." The manor was a towering relic from another century, stone walls stained with moss, windows shuttered and staring like blind eyes, and gargoyle statues twisted with the weight of decades. Ivy crept along the facade in tangled knots, as if the house itself tried to strangle its past. A sudden chill bit into Rowan's neck as he stepped from the car. The air was thick with damp earth and something fouler, a whisper of decay mixed with burnt wood. The silence was unnatural, as though the manor had swallowed every sound but its own slow, creaking heartbeat. The massive front door creaked open at his touch, revealing a vast, dimly lit foyer. Dust motes floated like ghosts in shafts of fading light. The heavy scent of aged leather, mildew, and something metallic hung in the air. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to flicker with life whenever Rowan's gaze drifted. From the shadows beyond the grand staircase, a faint murmuring of voices echoed, indistinct and teasing. The house seemed to breathe, its floorboards groaning softly under unseen weight.
As Rowan's footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, a sudden cold gust blew through the manor, slamming the door shut behind him with a thunderous boom. And in that moment, Rowan knew he was no longer alone.
Rowan's fingers trembled as he reached out to touch one of the portraits lining the dusty foyer. The oil paint was cracked and faded, but the subject's eyes, sharp, cold and unblinking, seemed to bore into his very soul. The man wore an expression of stern warning, lips pressed tight, as if guarding a terrible secret. As Rowan stepped closer, the flickering light from an ancient chandelier cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently, flickering like dying flames. The air around the painting grew colder, and a faint whispering filled the room, soft at first, then rising in a low, unintelligible chant that sent chills down his spine. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, scanning the walls for the source. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing footsteps, faint laughter, the rustle of silk dresses in an empty hallway. Suddenly, a loose panel beneath the portrait slid open with a creak, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay an old, leather-bound journal, covered in dust and cobwebs. With a deep breath, Rowan opened the journal. The handwriting inside was hurried and slanted, stained with what looked like dried blood. They watch from the shadows, waiting. The blood of Blackwood binds the house, each generation cursed to guard the truth that must never be spoken. Beware the mirror in the east wing. It shows not your reflection, but your fate. A sudden chill swept the room as the whispers swelled into an urgent crescendo. Behind him, the sound of a heavy door creaking shut echoed through the manor. Rowan spun around. The grand staircase was swallowed by shadows, and a cold breath brushed past his ear, whispering a single, terrifying word. Stay. Rowan's pulse quickened as he made his way toward the east wing, the manor's long corridors stretching out before him like veins in a forgotten corpse. The wallpaper was peeling, stained with water and age, and the floorboards groaned beneath his every step, as if protesting his intrusion. At the end of the hallway, a heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, an ornate, full-length mirror dominated the far wall, its gilded frame tarnished, but still intricate, carved with twisting vines and strange symbols Rowan couldn't recognize. The air grew colder still as he stepped inside, a thin layer of dust disturbed by his feet. His breath fogged the glass as he approached. The reflection that stared back was not quite his own. At first it was subtle, the way his eyes seemed darker, deeper, as if drowning in shadows. Then, the room behind him in the mirror shifted. Where the real room was empty, the reflection showed a figure, a woman dressed in tattered black lace, her face pale and hollow, eyes gleaming with a sorrowful malice. Rowan's heart hammered in his chest as the woman lifted a hand, beckoning him closer with a trembling finger. A whisper curled from the mirror, carried on a breath cold as graveyard soil. Join us. He stumbled backward, knocking over an old chair with a crash. The figure vanished, the mirror's surface smooth and empty once more. The whispers persisted, rising like a tide in the walls. Rowan pressed his hands to his ears, fighting to drown out the ghostly voices, but one phrase echoed again and again. The past never dies. The house seemed to breathe around Rowan. Each creak and groan of the old manor, like a whispered secret pressed against his skin. He moved cautiously down the hallway, the fading daylight outside casting long, distorted shadows through the cracked window panes. Every step echoed with a hollow resonance, the walls themselves seeming to pulse with unseen life. Faint voices floated through the plaster, half-formed words, laughter twisted with sorrow, like memories trapped in the fabric of the house. As he passed a peeling tapestry depicting a hunting scene, Rowan paused. The figures seemed to shift in the corner of his eye, moving just beyond the edge of sight. His breath hitched. Suddenly, the floorboard beneath him creaked loudly, and a cold gust of air rushed up from the depths below, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. A faint scratching noise began behind the walls, slow at first, then frantic, like claws scraping desperately to break free. Rowan pressed his ear against the rough plaster. Beneath the surface, he could swear he heard breathing, shallow, ragged, and terrified. A sudden slam echoed through the manor, and the lights flickered violently, throwing the hallway into deep shadow. He reached out blindly, hands brushing cold stone, heart pounding like a drum. Then, a voice whispered directly into his ear, urgent, sharp, and desperate. "Find the locket before it's too late." Rowan's mind raced as he clutched the cryptic warning like a lifeline. The locket. But where? And why? His footsteps led him to the grand library, a cavernous room filled with towering shelves, sagging under the weight of countless books. Dust hung thick, swirling in the pale light, filtering through stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across ancient tomes and forgotten relics. He rifled through drawers, overturned chairs, and sifted through piles of brittle papers. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the distant howl of the wind outside. Then, in a cracked leather-bound box beneath a loose floorboard, he found it. The locket. Ornate and delicate, made of tarnished silver with a faded red stone set into its center. The moment he touched it, a cold pulse surged through his fingers, a whisper of agony threading through his thoughts. Rowan hesitated but opened the locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, her eyes wide with fear, lips trembling as if caught mid-cry. Etched on the back was a single phrase, "Bound by blood, freed by fire." A sudden chill swept the room. The temperature dropped, and the flickering candlelight wavered as if struggling against an unseen draft. Without warning, the shadows deepened, and a figure materialized in the corner of the room. A tall woman, cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath a veil of shadow. Her voice was a hollow rasp. "Destroy it, or be consumed." Rowan's heart slammed against his ribs as the room darkened, and the oppressive weight of the curse pressed down upon him. The manor's oppressive silence shattered as Rowan lit a candle, its flickering flame trembling like a fragile heartbeat in the suffocating gloom. The locket lay heavy in his palm, a sinister weight that seemed to draw the shadows closer. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the window panes and stirring the ancient oaks beyond the garden walls. Rowan's breath came fast and shallow as he remembered the phrase etched inside the locket. "Bound by blood, freed by fire."
He knew what he had to do. With trembling hands, he carried the locket to the stone hearth in the library. The fire had long died to embers, but Rowan struck a match, the tiny flame sparking to life with a hiss. As the flame caught the locket's surface, a scream ripped through the manor, a sound so raw and terrible it clawed at his very soul. Shadows writhed and twisted around him, the air thickening with the acrid scent of burning metal and something far older, ancient rage. The locket glowed red hot, then exploded in a burst of searing light that threw Rowan backward. His ears rang with whispers of 100 voices, pleas, curses, and mournful farewells, all dissolving into silence. When he dared to look up, the shadowed figure was gone, the room bathed in a fragile peace. Yet in the quiet, Rowan felt eyes watching from the darkness, unseen, patient, and hungry.
The manor seemed to exhale a slow, heavy breath as Rowan rose from the floor, the remnants of the locket's destruction still warm in his palm. But the fragile calm was short-lived. A faint draft tugged at the edges of the library, carrying with it a whisper, soft and beckoning. Rowan's eyes caught a subtle anomaly in the wooden paneling near the fireplace, a faint outline like a door cleverly concealed. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, Rowan pressed his palm against the panel. It shuddered, then swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into blackness. The scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic drifted upward. He gripped his flashlight and descended into the darkness, each step echoing the narrow stone tunnel. At the bottom, a heavy iron door barred his path, its surface rusted but covered with strange symbols etched deep into the metal, circles intertwined with sharp lines resembling the carvings on the locket's frame. Taking a deep breath, Rowan pushed the door open. Inside was a chamber, vast and cavernous, lit by flickering torches set in iron sconces. Walls lined with shelves held jars filled with strange powders and brittle bones. At the center stood a stone altar, stained dark with dried crimson. On the altar lay a book, bound in cracked black leather, its pages edged in silver. Rowan's fingers brushed the cover, and as he opened the book, a rush of cold air swept through the chamber. The pages revealed the manor's darkest secret, a centuries-old pact between the Blackwood family and something ancient, something hungry. The final words chilled him. To protect the bloodline, the shadows must feed. The price, one soul, every generation. Rowan's eyes raced over the faded script, each word etched in ink dark as spilled blood. The book told a story older than the manor itself, a tale of desperation and darkness. Centuries ago, the Blackwood ancestors had faced ruin, their fortune fading, their name cursed. In their desperation, they had made a pact with an ancient entity dwelling beneath the earth, a being of shadows and hunger that promised power and protection. But the price was cruel. Each generation must sacrifice a soul to the darkness, binding their bloodline
itself was a prison, a beacon calling forth the shadows to claim their due. Rowan's breath caught as he realized the weight of his inheritance. He was the last Blackwood, destined to continue the cycle, or to break it at terrible cost. A cold wind howled through the chamber, and the flickering torchlight cast grotesque shadows on the walls. The whispers returned, louder now, urgent, pleading, threatening. Choose, they hissed. Sacrifice or be consumed. Fear coiled in Rowan's stomach as he closed the book. The manor's silence pressed down on him like a shroud, and he knew that the shadows were watching, waiting for his decision. Night draped Blackwood Manor in its darkest shroud, the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. The air was electric with anticipation. Every creak of the house amplified like a drumbeat in Rowan's chest. He paced the great hall, clutching the ancient book, the final hope to end the curse. Outside, the wind howled through twisted branches, scratching the window, desolate claws. The shadows lengthened, cooling the edges as if alive. Rowan could feel their hungry eyes upon him, waiting for the ritual to begin. He drew a deep breath and gathered the ingredients the book demanded. Herbs with bitter scent, salt, and a silver dagger passed down through generations, its blade cold and heavy in his hand. At the center of the hall, he traced the ancient sigil described in the book, forming a protective circle that glowed faintly under the candlelight. Chanting, he. As he chanted the incantation, the air grew thick and suffocating. A low growl echoed from the manor's depths, rising to a roar as the walls trembled. From the darkness, figures emerged, twisted shapes of shadow and smoke, eyes burning with malevolent hunger. The shadows of the sacrificed, forever bound to the banner, clawed toward Rowan's circle. The battle had begun. His voice wavered, but did not break as he completed the final invocation. The silver dagger gleamed, pulsing with light. With a "ha!" Rowan plunged into the floor. A blinding flash filled the hall. When the light faded, the shadows writhed and screamed, dissipating into the ether like smoke in the wind. Exhausted but victorious, Rowan collapsed, the weight of centuries lifting from his shoulders. For now, the first fragile rays of dawn crept through the cracked windows, casting pale light across the shattered remnants of the ritual circle. The manor was still, but the silence held a fragile, uneasy promise. Rowan rose unsteadily, every muscle aching, eyes heavy with exhaustion and lingering fear. The curse was broken, or so he hoped. Outside, the forest stirred gently, the night storm giving way to a hesitant morning breeze. The house, once oppressive and suffocating, seemed to breathe more freely, its dark heart unburdened. But as Rowan stepped toward the threshold, a chill traced down his spine. From the shadows of the hall, a figure emerged, was not broken, only changed, and as the sun rose over Blackwood Manor, Rowan understood his true inheritance, the endless watch. He was no longer just a man, he was the shadow's keeper.